Hello, and welcome to this preview for making a custom belt. In this series of videos, we will go over the process of making a belt to a custom design. Going through the process of laying out a design to carve down the belt, carving the design on the belt, and finishing the belt once we are happy with the design. The stages for making this into the final belt are as follows. Aligning the design. Tracing the design. Cutting along the trace lines. Using the Beveler and Sculpting tools to raise the pattern. Finishing the edges of the belt, using Gum Tragacanth and the bone tools. Staining, or dyeing the leather. Sealing the leather before a primer paint layer is added. Applying the primer paint layer. Painting over the primer layer with the final paint color. Sealing the leather with a wax-based sealant. Punching the holes for the belt. Applying press studs and a buckle to make it a functional belt. The design will be generated on the computer, and printed out on paper. Because this is a long pattern, it needs some assembly once printed. Magic tape is used to pin the paper design to the leather. Once happy, water is sprayed on the leather to be able to manipulate it. A tracing tool, in my case, this is a broken needle in a handle, but a ballpoint pen will work the same. Because of the water content now in the leather, the tool used to trace will make a darker line in the leather, and when you look at the leather the pattern will come together. As the video highlights, there is a perspex slab that is under the belt. This serves two main jobs. The first is to remove any bounce back that the bench will give while carving. The second is to let me put a copy of the design underneath and reference back to it. The slab is around 30 mm, which is more than enough to reduce the strikes from the mallet. In order to start cutting the design, the leather needs to be wet again. The tool that is employed this time is called a swivel knife, and in my case, has a ceramic blade. This is not typically how they are bought. Normally a swivel knife will come with a metal blade which needs sharpening, whereas a ceramic blade does not. This is simply a task of following the pattern that was traced and cut along those lines. This requires a little force to get the cut line into the leather, however this is dependent on a lot of factors. With the entire pattern now transferred to the leather, and cut, it's time to get into the task of carving. Before starting, a rough idea of the desired outcome should be kept in mind. This is more important for complex and detailed designs. Examples could include Celtic patterns, animals, or something that is made up of different depths. This design has 42 independent characters that can mostly be treated as their own carving. The main reason for this is there is nothing linking them together. That being said, the font does not help with this carving. What I want to do with this carving is racing all the characters. Being in the Old English font, it would be far easier to sync all of them. This, however, would not look as good. The main problem with the Old English font is all the serifs and little details, which are easy to lose when carving. There are two main tools that I will be using, these being the bevelers and the spoon tool. Where bevelers are available in a lot of different sizes, I typically stick to using two. These are a big beveler and a medium beveler, however this is a small one, in my tools. They are used to push the leather down along cut lines. Depending on which one is used will determine the amount of cleanup needed afterwards. The smallest beveler used gives a harsher fall-off, meaning the use of the spoon and bone folder is needed to remove that harshness. Whereas the big beveler gives a nice smooth fall-off that doesn't require much cleanup. The spoon tool is used most of the time, provided the leather is wet enough to take manual manipulation. This is done by hand and the amount of pressure applied will determine the outcome. Unlike hitting it with a mallet, some strength, both in the fingers and the hand is needed. Now on to staining the belt. I will be using an antique leather stain called saddle tan. This was picked over dyes as the saddle tan finish looks pretty interesting when having colored paint applied next to it. It will also react differently to a dye on leather, as leather is a natural resource, and therefore makes the stain a more unpredictable finish. In order to stain the belt there are some things that are needed. Firstly, we need the stain we are going to use, and secondly, we need a sponge to apply the stain. Gloves are advised so the stain does not go all over your hands. To start staining, I take the sponge and apply some water to it. This makes the stain more fluid. This will help get a nice distribution of stain throughout the leather, and in the carved area, provide a depth of color. With the stain applied, the next part will take some patience. This is because we need to wait for the stain to seep into the leather enough for it to hold the information. After the leather has been standing for enough time, we can move on to the next step, which is removing the surface stain. This is a personal preference, as the longer the stain is left on the leather, the darker the color will turn. This will provide a contrast between the carved and uncarved areas of the belt. We remove the stain in much the same way we apply it. However, instead of a sponge, we will use some tissue, which has been saturated with water. This is done only on the surface of the leather, and nowhere else. We want to bring as much of the stain off as we can, which will make the contrast even more striking. Do keep in mind that this is directly impacted by the time you left the stain on. Moving on, the next step is to use Gum Tragacanth and a bone tool to polish the edges. It is done after the staining so that the composition of the Gum Tragacanth doesn't affect the staining outcome. The Gum Tragacanth is applied to the edge of the belt to lubricate the action of the tools. The trick is to apply enough pressure onto the leather so the fibers bind together. The resulting edge is a smooth polished surface. Prior to this, the edge needs breaking with an edging tool. As seen in the video, the belt is mounted in a wooden holder to help keep the belt in the correct position for the process. It should be noted that the back of the belt on the untreated side of the hide is by default rough. This will not do for an item that is potentially in constant daily use. In order to remedy this, the same trick on the edges is applied to the back. This means putting Gum Tragacanth on the back of the belt and polishing it using the tools. The only difference this time is we are going to use a slab of glass rather than a bone tool for the majority. Personally, I prefer to use the bone tools, but the glass allows for more pressure and you can scrape with the edges of the glass, unlike the bone tools. The next stage is sealing the leather. This is done now so that the saddle tan doesn't interfere with the paint. The seal I will be using is called Resolene. Where you can apply this with a piece of tissue, the wool dubber is a better tool for this. All that needs to be done is coat the surface of the belt in a layer of Resolene, protecting the paint that will be applied. This will take 2 coats. The first coat should lift some of the stain, whereas the second coat should not lift as much or any. Now we move on to painting. This, depending on the design, can take as long as carving. The reason for this is you will need to apply 2 primer coats and then your final color. In the case of this project, there is a single color, so the total time to paint was about 1.5 hours. In comparison, the carving took around 9 hours. The only difficult part of this design is, as stated prior, the font. All I do with painting is trace the raised areas of the text, and where necessary manually paint in serifs or the little bits that were lost in carving. Although this sounds like a cheating way of getting the design across, painting over the carving is a way to emphasize the work. Because I was happy with the white text against the saddle tan, I opted to leave the paint color white. This meant that I only needed to paint the 2 primer layers. Once I was happy, I applied a 3rd coat of Resolene to the belt. This helped seal the paint. Before we sealed the saddle tan, however, the paint needs this treatment as well. While waiting for the Resolene to dry, I set to work making 2 belt keepers. Keepers are the little loops on the belt that you will put the excess through to keep it neat when wearing. They were built the same as the belt, only without the carving. The only real difference is that they are short pieces of leather that need stitching together at the end. Once the keepers and belt were ready, I apply a wax-based polish. This is called Kiwi Neutral Boot Polish. It is applied with a polishing brush, and will dull the leather down drastically. This is not a problem as we will be using a polishing brush afterwards to bring the shine back. This wax polish layer is done so that the belt is protected and waterproof. The final thing to do, in order to make this a functional belt, is to punch the holes and apply the fixtures. This is done with hole punches. They, like everything else in the process, are manual tools. Although the tools are easy to use and made of metal, the leather is resistant to the punches. This means that strength in the hands is needed to apply enough force to cut the holes. 7 holes are punched at the end of the belt. These are to put the buckle through and allow the user to fasten the belt. At the other end, there are 4 holes punched with a slightly smaller tool. These are for the fixtures. In the case of the belt, they will be press studs. In order to set the press stud on the belt, an anvil and setting tool are required for the front-facing part of the press stud. This is only a little circular disc of metal with a dome on one side. The face of the press stud sits in the dome and you hit the other side with the setting tool. A quick twist of the back of the press stud will show if it has taken. If you can move it, then it needs hitting again to try to set it. With the belt now fully assembled, it is ready to be used as a functional item. The entire process of making the belt, with carving, took just over 12.5 hours. It should be noted that the process can be significantly sped up by not videoing the steps. However, if a design is needed, the overall time will vary. Thank you for watching. You can check our other videos on the Pewter Scribe on YouTube.